John Harris was exhausted. After months of intense investigation, he had finally taken a few days off to relax, a rare luxury in his career. The transatlantic flight to London would be long, but that didn't bother him. In fact, he was looking forward to those hours in the air, away from the chaos of work, away from the hectic pace of his recent weeks. Aboard the Boeing 787, the atmosphere seemed calm. The passengers were settled, some already asleep, while others flipped through magazines or watched their seatback screens. John gazed out the window, watching the city lights below slowly fade as the plane ascended. He felt grateful for the momentary silence, the soft hum of the engines providing a constant, almost soothing backdrop. He adjusted his seat and looked around. In front of him, a tired-looking woman was trying to soothe her intermittently crying baby. A few rows to the right, a couple was quietly arguing, the man glancing repeatedly at his phone while the woman crossed her arms, clearly frustrated. These were small details of everyday life that normally wouldn't catch his attention. But something in his instincts, that old investigative intuition, told him something was off. He tried to shake off the feeling. He was on vacation, after all. There was no reason to be concerned. But in his line of work, he had learned to trust that kind of gut feeling. And as he scanned the passengers, his eyes landed on the flight crew. A blonde flight attendant, probably in her 30s, was moving through the aisle, handing out drinks. She seemed nervous, her movements were quick and somewhat erratic, as if she was trying to finish her duties as fast as possible. When she passed by John's seat, he noticed that she avoided eye contact, which only piqued his interest further. Behind her, a burly man dressed in a black suit stood up and slowly made his way to the back of the plane. He didn't seem nervous, but his steps were deliberate, as if he were analyzing the environment. John tracked him with his eyes, trying to figure out what the man was up to. The man stopped for a moment near the cockpit door and exchanged a brief glance with one of the flight attendants, who gave a nearly imperceptible nod before continuing his service. It was a quick gesture, one most passengers would likely have missed, but not John. That uncomfortable feeling returned with more intensity. He tightened his seatbelt, trying to relax, but his mind was already working, processing those small clues. The sound of the baby crying again brought John back to the present moment. The woman in the row ahead was still trying to calm her child, gently rocking him as the baby fussed. She glanced around, clearly embarrassed by the attention her child was drawing from other passengers. John gave her a sympathetic smile, but his focus wasn't on her anymore. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and the cabin was gradually dimming, creating a calm, almost sleepy atmosphere. Yet John's unease only grew. The behavior of the man and the crew lingered in his mind. Maybe he was being paranoid, maybe he was reading too much into minor interactions, but something inside him told him otherwise. He decided to keep a close eye on things. He wouldn't intervene unless absolutely necessary. After all, he didn't have anything concrete. It was just an ordinary flight, and the last thing he wanted was to cause alarm over a suspicion with no real foundation. The blonde flight attendant came back down the aisle, this time with her eyes fixed on the floor. She avoided any interaction with the passengers and disappeared into the back of the plane near the galley. John watched her for a few more seconds before leaning back in his seat, his mind spinning with possibilities. As he tried to relax, the man in the black suit reappeared, this time walking toward the front of the plane. He stopped again near the cockpit, now holding something small in his hands. John frowned, trying to make out what it was, but the man quickly hid the object in his jacket pocket and entered the restroom. John checked his watch. They had been in the air for just over an hour. Several more hours to go before they reached their destination. He sighed, resigned, and closed his eyes, forcing his mind to shut off. But that feeling continued to gnaw at him, insistent, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Suddenly, The plane shook slightly, a gentle turbulence, just enough to rouse the more inattentive passengers. John opened his eyes and glanced around, but no one seemed alarmed. It was just the normal movement of a flight, nothing out of the ordinary. He took a deep breath, determined to ignore his instincts for at least a few more hours. But deep down, he knew he was being drawn into something bigger than he realized. The flight that was supposed to be his break from the world was slowly turning into something else. Something much darker. The calm on the flight slowly began to unravel. The plane cut through the dark sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was growing heavier. John was fully awake now, his senses sharpened, watching every movement. That unsettling feeling, which he had initially tried to ignore, was now inescapable. The hours dragged on, and the man in the black suit, the same one who had piqued his curiosity earlier, was up again. He moved with that same quiet confidence, walking down the aisle, but this time his expression was more tense. The clock on the seatback screen showed they were about 2.5 hours from the European coast. It was then that John noticed something that heightened his alertness. The blonde flight attendant, who had seemed nervous before, was now missing. Usually, the crew takes turns ensuring the passengers are attended to, but her absence was noticeable, at least to someone with John's trained eyes. He glanced around, expecting to see her emerge from somewhere, but she didn't appear. A gentle bout of turbulence shook the cabin, causing a few passengers to murmur in discomfort. John didn't think much of it until a low, muffled sound echoed from the direction of the cockpit. It was subtle, a noise that could have easily gone unnoticed by most people, but not by John. It sounded like a thud, as if something had fallen or someone had been thrown against a surface. His eyes immediately locked on the cockpit door. What he saw next made his pulse quicken. The access light above the cockpit door was on. Someone had entered or exited recently. John straightened in his seat, straining his eyes to observe more closely. The cockpit door was closed, as it should be, but something about the space around it had changed. The plane continued its course without issue, but the feeling that something was about to happen grew stronger. A few minutes passed before an announcement came over the PA system. The voice speaking wasn't the pilot's or the co-pilot's. It was a firm, emotionless voice, clearly trying to mask any hint of nervousness. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your flight attendant speaking. We're experiencing a minor technical difficulty in the cockpit, but there's no need to panic. We ask that you remain in your seats and keep your seatbelts fastened. The situation is being handled. Thank you for your cooperation." John frowned. He didn't like the tone of that message. There were no details, and the fact that a flight attendant was handling communication instead of the pilots didn't sit right with him. He looked around. A few passengers seemed confused, but not many appeared alarmed. He leaned back in his seat, more alert than ever. The flight attendant who had made the announcement reappeared shortly afterward, walking down the aisles with a forced calm expression. He stopped at the row ahead of John to assist the woman with the now sleeping baby. John watched him carefully, his eyes tracking every move. The attendant seemed to be going through the motions, performing his duties, but there was something about his posture that betrayed a controlled nervousness. When he passed by John, the investigator gave him a quick nod, acknowledging him in a casual manner. The attendant avoided eye contact, hurrying to the back of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that led to the galley. John considered whether he should get up and follow, but he decided to wait. There were still pieces missing from the puzzle, and he knew a premature move could alert whoever was involved. The plane shuddered again slightly, and John heard new murmurs from the passengers. And then, without warning, the cabin lights flickered once, twice, 3 times, before going out completely. Only the emergency lights remained on, bathing the cabin in a pale red glow. The silence was broken by hushed whispers and the growing discomfort of the passengers. John stood up quickly, defying the earlier instruction to remain seated. He knew time was running out. Something was happening in the cockpit, and no one was offering a clear explanation. He made his way toward the front of the plane, trying not to draw too much attention, but his progress was halted when the cockpit door burst open. The light from inside the cockpit briefly illuminated the aisle, revealing a scene that made John's stomach drop. The pilot was lying on the floor, either unconscious or worse. A second man, wearing a crew member's uniform, was crouched over him, checking his pulse with a panicked expression. The man looked up and locked eyes with John, his lips moving silently. But before he could make any move, the cockpit door slammed shut with a loud click, locked again. John took a step forward, but was interrupted by a firm hand gripping his arm. He turned to see the same flight attendant who had made the announcement. The man's expression was now much different. The earlier nervousness had been replaced with something darker, a determined look that said he knew much more than he was letting on. "Go back to your seat," the attendant said, his voice low, but without the courtesy it had held before. John hesitated for a moment, but the attendant tightened his grip, making it clear there would be no further discussion. Reluctantly, John returned to his seat, but his mind was racing. The plane was under someone else's control. And from what he had just seen, those responsible were no longer in the cockpit. Back in his seat, John tried to get comfortable, but his mind was far from relaxed. He was certain the plane was under the control of someone who wasn't part of the official crew, but who? And why? The situation was far from clear, and the frustration of not knowing what was really happening gnawed at him. He glanced around, trying to gauge the reactions of the other passengers, but to his surprise, few seemed to grasp the seriousness of what had just occurred. Most of the passengers were restless but unaware of the deeper implications. The lack of clear communication led many to believe it was just a technical failure. The woman with the baby briefly glanced at John, her eyes filled with anxiety, as if searching for reassurance that everything was fine. John just nodded slightly, trying to project calm, but inside, his mind was working overtime. He knew he had to understand better who was involved. The first clear lead was the flight attendant who had confronted him. His shift in demeanor was a clear indicator that he was part of something larger. There was also the man in the suit, whose every move seemed more suspicious by the minute. If there was a connection between those two, John needed to watch them more closely. The blonde flight attendant, still absent, also weighed on his mind. Her behavior before the incident suggested she knew something. She might be a minor player in the scheme, but she was still involved. John knew that if he was going to figure out what was going on, he needed more information. Taking a deep breath, he decided that waiting passively was no longer an option. Moving slowly so as not to draw attention, he unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up. He looked toward the back of the plane, where the flight attendant had disappeared. There was something back there he needed to see. Walking with measured confidence, John made his way down the aisle, discreetly observing the faces of the passengers. Most were still distracted by their screens or unsettled by the turbulence and the strange lighting in the cabin. But as he neared the galley area, he noticed a small group of people whispering. Among them was the man in the black suit. John stopped for a moment, watching from a distance. They seemed to be having a heated conversation, though keeping their voices low. The man in the suit was speaking with an air of authority, while two other passengers, who previously seemed like ordinary travelers, were now listening intently, as if receiving instructions. John knew he couldn't get too close without raising suspicion. So, instead, he blended in. Casually, he approached the snack area and grabbed a cup of water, pretending to be distracted. From his position, he could catch fragments of the conversation, though the words were scattered. "Keep calm. Everything will be fine soon," the man in the suit said. That message wasn't a mistake. Everything's under control. The other two nodded, looking worried but determined. John knew something bigger was happening, but the motive was still unclear. What were they planning? And why were none of the other passengers reacting to the gravity of the situation? Before he could pick up more from the conversation, something caught his attention. The blonde flight attendant reappeared, emerging from one of the side doors with a pale expression. She was carrying a tray of water bottles and cups, but her hands were shaking, and she was clearly sweating. Her eyes avoided John's, but he could see the fear written across her face. John's intuition told him she knew more than she was letting on. He took a few steps toward her, grabbing a bottle of water as he spoke casually. "You all right? You look a little pale." She hesitated for a second before answering, almost in a whisper. "I'm fine. Just a bit of turbulence." The answer didn't convince him for a second. Something was seriously wrong. Before he could press her further, the man in the suit shot a glance in her direction, and she quickly lowered her head and hurried away. The tension between them was undeniable. John watched as she disappeared again, probably returning to wherever she had been hiding earlier. He realized that if he wanted to uncover what was truly happening, he would need to follow her. But doing so without raising suspicion would require caution. As he made his way back to his seat, John's mind was already piecing together his next steps. He knew he was dealing with a complicated situation, possibly a conspiracy involving several people on board. There was no more denying the signs. Back in his seat, he pretended to relax, but his eyes were fixed on the side door where the flight attendant had disappeared. Something deeper was happening, something involving not just the crew, but also certain passengers. He needed more information before he could act. But with every passing minute, John felt that time was running out. John remained seated, but his mind was racing. The picture was becoming clearer. The man in the suit, the flight attendant, and possibly other crew members were involved in something much bigger than a technical issue. He needed to act, but he couldn't do it alone. Every move had to be calculated, and most importantly, he needed more information to understand the full extent of the threat. The plane continued its course, but the sense that something was off didn't leave John. He was about to make his move when something caught his attention. The man in the suit was standing again. He walked slowly down the aisle, speaking quietly to certain passengers. John watched carefully, trying to pick up on any detail that might reveal more about the unfolding plan. Suddenly, one of the passengers, a large man sitting a few rows away, abruptly stood up. His face was flushed with anger, and he began shouting, drawing the attention of everyone in the cabin. "What's going on here? Why won't anyone tell us what's really happening?" The shout echoed through the cabin, and chaos quickly followed. Several passengers started murmuring among themselves, and panic was on the verge of breaking out. The large man stormed down the aisle toward the cockpit, determined to confront the crew. John quickly stood up, knowing that this kind of impulsive reaction could make the situation worse. As the man reached the cockpit door, the flight attendant who had confronted John earlier appeared, blocking the way. "Sir, please return to your seat," the attendant said, his voice low but firm. "We're dealing with a technical issue, but I assure you, everything will be resolved soon." The passenger, however, wasn't having it. "That's a lie. Something's wrong, and you're not telling us." "I'm not sitting down while we're in danger." He tried to push past the attendant, but was met with resistance. John knew he had to step in before things spiraled out of control. He moved quickly, positioning himself between the passenger and the flight attendant. "Calm down," John said, looking the large man in the eye. "Causing a scene isn't going to help anyone. Let me talk to them." The man seemed ready to protest, but something in John's stance made him hesitate. The flight attendant, however, remained firm, his eyes narrowing as he looked at John. There was a palpable tension in the air, and the silence between them stretched for a few seconds. "You don't have permission to be here," the attendant finally said, breaking the silence, his voice now carrying a hint of threat that hadn't been there before. "Go back to your seat, or we're going to have bigger problems." John held his gaze for a moment, assessing the situation. He knew the attendant was directly involved in whatever was going on, and any wrong move could trigger something far worse. But he also knew he couldn't just go back to his seat without answers. Something needed to be done, and quickly. "Look," John said, lowering his voice to almost a whisper so no one else would hear. "I know you're hiding something. And, honestly, I don't care what it is, yet. But if this involves putting everyone's lives at risk, then I have a problem." The flight attendant's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. He seemed to be calculating his options, deciding whether to confront John here and now or let him be. Finally, he took a step back, his tone softening, but still loaded with authority. "You don't understand the situation. Don't cause any more trouble," he said before turning and walking toward the back of the plane. John watched him disappear behind the curtains again. He was sure this wouldn't be the last time he would have to face him. Turning back to the main aisle, he saw that the large man was about to make another move. Before he could act again, John placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Let me handle this. If you push too hard, you'll end up putting us all in more danger," John said, his voice steady. The passenger hesitated, but eventually nodded reluctantly, returning to his seat. The other passengers who had stood up slowly began to settle down, though the murmurs of distress continued. Back in his seat, John knew he had to be more cautious. The crew was on high alert, and any movement could trigger an aggressive response. The man in the suit, who up until now had seemed like a mysterious passenger, was clearly involved in something bigger. The situation was slipping out of control, and John needed to act fast, but with extreme care. He cast a glance toward the back of the plane where the flight attendant had disappeared. He needed to find out what was happening there, but he couldn't do it alone. At some point, he would have to confront those behind this. The silent turbulence shaking the plane seemed to mirror the growing tension inside the cabin. John, now more alert than ever, knew that the real confrontation was still to come. As John made his way back to his seat, his thoughts wouldn't stop racing. He knew there was an important piece missing, something he hadn't uncovered yet. The confrontation with the flight attendant had made it clear that he was dealing with a situation much larger than a simple hijacking, but the real motive remained a mystery. He needed to figure out what was happening before it was too late. Sitting down, he observed the cabin again. The atmosphere of distrust and tension was palpable. Many passengers were starting to look at each other, unsure of who they could trust. The cockpit remained sealed, and the silence from the flight deck only heightened the sense that something sinister was about to unfold. John knew he couldn't trust anyone. Determined to get answers, he stood up again, this time with the intention of heading to the back of the plane. There was something in that area he needed to see. As he began walking down the aisle, his eyes met those of the man in the suit. The man's look was cold and calculating, and for a brief moment, John felt like he was being sized up, as if the man knew he was trying to uncover something. But John remained calm. He continued walking until he reached the rear of the plane, where the curtains separated the galley and restroom from the passengers. When he passed through the curtains, he found the blonde flight attendant again. This time, she was alone, her posture tense, her hands trembling as she arranged some water bottles. John knew this was the right moment to get answers. "We need to talk," John said bluntly. "I know you're involved in this somehow. I don't want to get you in trouble, but I need to know what's going on." The flight attendant looked at him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. I can't talk," she whispered, looking away. If they find out I said anything, we're all dead. John stepped closer, trying to be as gentle as possible, but making it clear he wasn't going to back down. If you don't talk, this situation is going to get worse. They already know something's wrong, and people here are going to start acting on their own. It won't be long before this turns into chaos. If you tell me what's going on, maybe I can help. The flight attendant looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to be listening. She took a deep breath, battling her fear, and finally murmured, "The plane, it's being diverted. They're taking the aircraft to an unknown location. This is part of a bigger plan. And there's more, it's not just the hijackers. They have accomplices among the passengers." John wasn't surprised by the revelation, but the fact that the accomplices were among the passengers made him reevaluate all of his previous interactions. The man in the suit was clearly involved, but who else? Who else could be playing a role in this scheme? He took a deep breath, absorbing the information. "And the pilot?" he asked. "Is he hurt or?" The flight attendant shook her head. "They pulled him out of the cockpit. He's unconscious, but still alive. I don't know what they plan to do with him." John's brow furrowed. This confirmed his worst suspicions. The crew was being manipulated, and the situation was out of control. If the plane was being diverted to an unknown location, the consequences could be catastrophic. He knew he needed to act before the plan was fully executed. "I need to get into that cockpit," John said firmly. "If we can regain control of the plane, we can stop this from going any further. But I'm going to need your help." The flight attendant hesitated, her expression full of fear. I don't know how I can help. They're watching everything. If they see me with you, they'll know I told you." John thought for a moment. "Are they watching the cockpit? The flight attendant and the man in the suit, are they always nearby?" She nodded. "Yes. They take turns, but there's always someone watching. I don't know how you're going to get in there without them noticing." John knew he had to be strategic. It wouldn't be easy, but he had to try. "I'm going to distract one of them. I need you to let me know when the cockpit is clear, even if it's just for a second. Any opening I can use." The flight attendant hesitated again, but finally nodded. "I'll try. But, be careful." John gave her a small smile, though he knew the situation was far from light. "I always am." With new information in hand, John returned to his seat, more determined than ever. Now that he knew the plane was being diverted, the urgency to regain control was even greater. He glanced again at the man in the suit, who was still calmly talking with another passenger. All signs pointed to him being one of the leaders of the plan. The situation was critical, but John knew that if he could act quickly and with precision, there was still a chance to stop the worst from happening. He just needed the right moment to get into the cockpit and prevent the plan from being carried out. John sat back in his seat, processing everything he had just learned. The plane was being diverted to an unknown destination, and there were accomplices among the passengers. This explained the suspicious interactions he had been noticing, but the situation was far worse than he initially imagined. If the plan was to divert the plane, the reason could be anything, from a ransom to something much more destructive. The only thing he knew for certain was that time was running out. The blonde flight attendant had resumed her duties, walking down the aisle and trying to act as normal as possible. John could tell she was nervous, but she was doing her best not to show it. He needed her help to identify the right moment to act, but he knew that any premature move could ruin everything. He had to wait for the right time. The plane shook slightly, and the sound of turbulence began to dominate the cabin. The passengers seemed more unsettled now, with some whispering quietly, worried about the lack of clear communication from the crew. The tension was increasing by the minute, and John knew that panic could break out at any moment. He watched the flight attendant and the man in the suit, who were now stationed near the cockpit door, almost like guards. There was little room to maneuver, but John had a plan. He waited until the flight attendant briefly stepped away, probably to check on the galley at the back of the plane. In that short window of time, the blonde flight attendant passed by John and whispered quickly, "The cockpit will be unoccupied for a few minutes, it's now or never." This was the chance he needed. John stood up slowly, trying to remain as natural as possible, and began walking down the aisle. His breathing was controlled, but his heart pounded in his chest. He knew the man in the suit was watching everything, and any wrong move could give him away. As he neared the cockpit, John pretended to head toward the restroom but stopped in front of the cockpit door. His mind worked fast, assessing the situation. The flight attendant had said the pilot was unconscious but alive. That meant if he could take control, there was still time to reroute the plane back to its original path. He just needed access to the controls. The man in the suit, who was only a few meters away, noticed John's movements and began walking toward him. Knowing he had little time, John acted fast. He pushed against the cockpit door with force, and it gave way with a creak. Inside, the pilot was slumped over, exactly as the flight attendant had described, but the controls were still operational. John threw himself into the co-pilot's seat and began studying the instruments quickly. The sound of footsteps approaching made John's heart race. The man in the suit was coming. Without hesitation, John locked the cockpit door, knowing he had only minutes before they would try to force it open. He needed time to assess the controls and figure out how to return the plane to its original course. The navigation systems were all set to a specific coordinate, a location in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. John frowned. Why were they heading toward the middle of the ocean? The thought that the plane might be used as a weapon began to form in his mind, and he realized the plan was much worse than he had anticipated. They weren't just diverting the plane to another location. They were planning to destroy it mid-flight, likely to create an aerial disaster that would shock the world. He tried recalibrating the controls but quickly realized there was a block in place. The navigation system was programmed to follow the designated route, and any attempt to change it triggered an emergency protocol. The hijackers had thought of everything. John felt sweat running down his forehead as he typed furiously, trying to override the system. Every second counted. From outside the cockpit, he heard a loud bang against the door. The man in the suit was trying to break in, likely with help. John knew he didn't have much time before they would manage to force their way through. He needed a quick solution. Then, he spotted a small panel on the right side of the cockpit. It was sealed with a security lock, but John knew what it was: the manual override system for the automatic route. He pulled a small tool from his pocket and began working on the seal, forcing it open. The sound of metal being struck from outside grew louder, but John was focused. Time seemed to be slipping away. With a snap, the seal finally broke, and John pulled the lever to disable the automatic route. The panel flickered for a moment, and then, all the cockpit alarms began to blare. He knew he had triggered the alert, but at least now he had manual control over the plane. With steady hands, John began adjusting the controls to redirect the plane back to its original route. But the final blow to the cockpit door made him realize his time was up. The door burst open, and the man in the suit stormed in with force. He lunged at John, trying to pull him away from the controls. The fight was quick and intense. John knew he couldn't let the man regain control, so he used all his strength to shove him against the cockpit wall. The plane shook slightly, but John managed to keep his hands on the controls. Finally, with a decisive move, John pushed the man against the door, knocking him out temporarily. He knew he didn't have much time before the flight attendant or other accomplices showed up, but for now, he was in control. The plane began to stabilize along the new route. John could only hope there was still enough time to save everyone before the deadly plan could be fully executed. John felt the sweat dripping down his back as he struggled to keep control of the plane. The man in the suit, now unconscious, lay slumped against the cockpit wall, but that didn't mean the danger had passed. Far from it, he knew the other accomplices, likely the flight attendant and some of the passengers, would soon realize what was happening. The blaring sirens in the cockpit, triggered when he disabled the autopilot, made it impossible for the remaining crew to ignore what was going on. With his hand steady on the controls, John managed to stabilize the plane and begin the process of steering it back to its original course. But he knew the situation was far from resolved. The accomplices on board had a plan, and they weren't going to give it up easily. John needed help, and most importantly, he needed time. The sound of hurried footsteps outside the door told him that the reaction had already begun. A loud knock echoed, followed by a firm pounding. It was the flight attendant, demanding that the door be opened. John knew he couldn't let him in. If he lost control now, everything would be over. He leaned over the controls, trying to locate the emergency communication system. After a few frantic seconds of searching, he finally found the right button and activated the microphone to speak with air traffic control. His voice came out tense but controlled. "This is John Harris. I'm on board Flight 893, which has been hijacked. I'm in control of the plane now, but the situation is critical. There are accomplices on board, and they attempted to divert the plane. I need help immediately." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a rapid response. "Mr. Harris, we are aware of the situation. Authorities have been notified, and rescue teams are being mobilized. We need you to maintain the course and follow our instructions. Help is on the way." The words offered John some relief, but he knew there was still a lot to do. The flight attendant wouldn't give up easily. He glanced at the man in the suit lying on the floor and wondered what his next move should be. He couldn't just leave the accomplices loose in the cabin, and at any moment, they could try to force the door again. Another loud bang echoed against the door. John quickly got up, locking the door more securely and checking for any other way to prevent entry. He found a safety latch and used it to reinforce the lock, but he knew it wouldn't hold them off for long. However, before he could do more, the door burst open with tremendous force. The flight attendant and two other men charged in with fury. John barely had time to react before the three men attacked, trying to force him away from the controls. A fierce struggle ensued, with John desperately trying to defend himself while they attempted to subdue him. The plane rocked violently as one of the men landed a blow to John's face, sending him sprawling backward onto the control panel. The turbulence from the fight threw the passengers outside the cockpit into panic, and chaos broke out in the cabin. John knew he couldn't let them regain control, but he was clearly outnumbered. Using every bit of strength he had, John managed to get to his feet and shoved one of the men against the wall, temporarily stunning him. The flight attendant, however, was undeterred. He pulled a knife from his pocket and advanced on John with lethal intent. John barely dodged in time, but the next swing grazed his arm, leaving a trail of blood down his sleeve. The pain was intense, but John knew he couldn't stop. He grabbed a nearby emergency flashlight and, with a quick swing, struck the flight attendant on the head. The man staggered back but didn't fall. The struggle continued, with John trying desperately to keep them away from the controls. Amid the chaos, John managed to position himself between the men and the control panel again. He knew that if he lost control now, the hijackers' plan would be back in motion, and the plane would be doomed. The shouts from the passengers outside grew louder, the chaos in the plane reflecting the intensity of the fight taking place inside the cockpit. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, John shoved the flight attendant back hard, sending him crashing into the other accomplice. Both men fell to the floor, momentarily dazed. John, breathing heavily, took advantage of the brief reprieve to lock the cockpit door again. This time, he used every security latch he could find, knowing this would be his last chance to maintain control. The plane rocked violently, and John knew he needed to stabilize it before they lost altitude. He quickly returned to the pilot's seat and began adjusting the controls. His eyes scanned the instruments, calculating how much time he had left before the plane was completely back under control. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and his mind raced, but he knew he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. As he stabilized the plane, the alarms continued to blare. The cockpit door was damaged, and the accomplices were still outside, likely recovering from the fight. John knew they wouldn't give up. He needed a plan, something that would ensure the plane made it to safety without any further interference. Then he heard the voices on the radio again. "Mr. Harris, we're dispatching fighter jets to escort the plane back to the correct route. We need you to maintain altitude and follow the instructions. We are 15 minutes from interception." John exhaled slowly. 15 minutes. It seemed like an eternity under the circumstances, but it was all he had. He needed to keep control for long enough to ensure the jets arrived and secured the situation. He glanced at the cockpit door, waiting for the next move from the accomplices. Meanwhile, outside the cockpit, the passengers were starting to realize the gravity of the situation. The sound of the alarms and the violent rocking of the plane indicated that something was seriously wrong. John knew that panic among them could become another issue, but right now, he couldn't focus on that. His attention had to be on keeping the plane stable and safe until help arrived. The minutes passed slowly, each second filled with tension. The plane followed the route, but John knew that at any moment, the accomplices could attempt something desperate to regain control. The sound of soft knocking on the door indicated they were regrouping. He gripped the controls firmly, preparing for whatever came next. Suddenly, the communication lights on the panel blinked. "This is the Air Force. We are with you, Flight 893. We will remain by your side until your safety is ensured." John felt a momentary wave of relief but knew the situation wasn't over yet. He responded quickly over the radio, confirming the instructions and maintaining the course. The help was close, but the danger was still very real. The accomplices were cornered, and at any moment, they could make one final, desperate move. As the final minutes ticked by, John looked out the window and saw the fighter jets flying alongside the plane. The sight of the military aircraft brought greater relief, but he knew the real battle was still to be resolved. The fate of the plane and everyone on board was still in his hands, and he couldn't afford to falter now. John looked out at the fighter jets now escorting the plane, holding formation alongside the commercial aircraft. The brief sense of relief washed over him, but he knew there was still more to be done. The accomplices in the plane hadn't given up yet, and he couldn't let his guard down. The blaring alarms in the cockpit, triggered when he took manual control, were a constant reminder that the remaining crew and passengers knew something was wrong. With his hands steady on the controls, John managed to keep the plane on course. The radio communication from air traffic control kept him grounded, but he knew the most critical part was still ahead. He had to land the plane, and that would be the moment of greatest risk. He glanced over at the cockpit door, which was still shaking slightly from the earlier struggle. The accomplices were behind that door, possibly planning their next move. He couldn't afford to make a mistake now. He checked the instruments again, adjusting the altitude as the descent toward the emergency landing began. His mind raced through the possibilities. The accomplices knew their plan was failing, and desperation could drive them to do something drastic. The minutes until touchdown would be the longest of John's life. The light of early morning was beginning to break through the clouds. The soft glow cast across the plane's wings, and John caught himself thinking how differently things could have gone if he hadn't been on this flight. But there was no time for reflection now. He needed to stay clear-headed, focused. The communication with air traffic control continued. John followed each instruction carefully, preparing the plane for the emergency landing. The minutes dragged on, and the sound of muffled voices and footsteps from outside the cockpit told him that the accomplices were still active. He knew they were waiting for their chance, watching for any opening they could exploit. Then, the cockpit door began to shake more violently. The blows were stronger, more frantic. They knew the plane was about to land, and they were running out of time. John braced himself for the inevitable. He knew this final confrontation was coming. With a loud crash, the door of the cockpit broke partially open, and one of the accomplices, the flight attendant, managed to wedge his arm through the gap. John turned quickly, using all his strength to push the door back, trying to block the entrance. The man let out a frustrated growl, but John didn't give in. The plane rocked slightly, but John regained control. He knew that if he lost control now, the entire flight would be in jeopardy. The steady hum of the fighter jets outside reminded him that help was close, but they couldn't intervene inside the plane. It was up to him to hold off the accomplices. Finally, the communication came through from air traffic control again. "Mr. Harris, we are ready for the landing. Begin your emergency descent now." John took a deep breath, adjusted the controls, and started the descent. The plane began to tilt gently, and he felt the weight of gravity pulling on his body. Every movement felt heavy, every adjustment more significant. He knew that if he didn't get this right, everyone on board would be in danger. The pounding on the door stopped for a moment, and John heard more muffled voices from the other side. He couldn't make out the words, but he knew the hijackers were planning something. With the plane descending, they would have little time to act. It was now or never. The tension in the cabin was building as the plane dropped lower and lower, following the precise instructions from air traffic control. John's eyes remained fixed on the instruments, but his ears were trained on the door behind him, ready for any sudden movement. He couldn't let his guard down for a second. Then, suddenly, the cockpit door gave way again. The flight attendant, along with another accomplice, managed to force their way into the space. John turned to face them, but he was in a vulnerable position. The two men charged at him with force. The struggle was fast and brutal. John tried to fend off the blows, but he was at a clear disadvantage. One of the men grabbed his arm and twisted, forcing him to momentarily release the controls. The plane jolted violently, and alarms blared louder. Summoning all his strength, John drove his elbow into the accomplice's side, freeing himself from the grip. He lunged toward the control panel, adjusting the plane's trajectory as he fought off the attackers. The situation was spiraling out of control, and he knew he had to act fast. With one final push, John grabbed an emergency fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it at the accomplice trying to pin him down. The man crumpled to the floor, dazed, but the flight attendant was still on his feet, advancing with a knife. John ducked just in time as the blade sliced through the air near his face. The fight continued as the plane continued its descent. The flight attendant was clearly desperate, and John knew he was willing to do anything to regain control. But John also knew he couldn't give up now. With one final burst of energy, he shoved the flight attendant against the cockpit wall, disarming him and sending him crashing to the floor. Breathing heavily, John returned to the controls. The plane was in a critical position, but he managed to stabilize it just in time. The runway lights were now visible ahead, and he knew the landing was close. But the fight had left him exhausted, and the emotional toll was beginning to weigh on him. The radio crackled to life again, and the calm voice of air traffic control brought him back to the moment. "You're almost there, Mr. Harris. Just a few more adjustments, and you'll be safe." John nodded to himself, knowing they couldn't see him. He made the final adjustments to the controls, focusing on the landing. The plane dipped lower and lower, and the wheels touched down on the runway with a controlled thud. He had done it. The plane gradually slowed, and the sound of the fighter jets circling overhead signaled that the mission was complete. John let out a long breath, his muscles finally relaxing. He glanced down at the unconscious flight attendant on the floor and knew that, for now, the immediate danger had passed. The emergency lights flashed as the plane came to a full stop. Outside, the authorities were already moving into position, and John knew help was moments away. He sat there for a moment, catching his breath, while the adrenaline slowly drained from his body. But then, something caught his eye. A small envelope, tucked into the control panel, with faint writing on the front. It was the same style of envelope he had seen earlier in the flight, back when he hadn't yet grasped the full scale of the situation. With trembling hands, he picked it up and opened it. Inside, there was just one sentence: "This was only the beginning." A cold chill ran down John's spine. The realization that something much bigger was at play hit him with full force. The plane was safe, the hijackers were neutralized, but the true mystery was only starting to unfold. He glanced out the window at the distant horizon where the sun was starting to rise. He knew that, although he had won this battle, the game was far from over.